Welcome to our 28th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today we're going to talk about Balkan nationalism. And for those of you who are familiar, please indulge me as I explain the rules. So this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, language, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. And I will be discussing it from a secular perspective. Now, there's definitely going to be religious topics because in a lot of cases, this nationalism has some sort of religious friction to it. And so I am going to be talking about that. All right. Now, again, let's be respectful of the topic, but that said, I really enjoy questions, comments, clarifications, anything that promotes that interactivity, especially as we move closer to the modern era and things become more and more tangible for people. This class will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something, I'll tell you something that you probably didn't know. And like every other presentation, there will be a 2-hour hard stop, which means that after 2 hours, I won't do any new slides. And it's sort of our agreement that there might be some conversation that happens afterward, but no new material. You won't miss anything if you have to leave. But that said, also, it will be recorded. So if you have to leave earlier or you want to reflect back on the 27 previous episodes, they're all there. You can all watch them. And of course, I know you're all excited and waiting for the quiz to see what everybody remembers from last week. All right. So question number 1. Which 3 of the following statements are accurate descriptions of the Cossacks? A. The Zaporozhian Sich was a strong ally of Poland and the Ottoman Empire, uniting with the Ottoman forces at the Battle of Chehrin and forcing the Russians out. The Cossacks existed at the edges of the Russian Empire and were eventually co-opted to serve the Russian Tsar. Hetmans Doroshenko and Mazepa from the west of the Dnieper promoted Russian alliances. Cossacks were Russian nobility who had power at the highest levels of the Tsardom. The Terek Cossacks in the Caucasus were effectively strike forces against the Caucasian Imamate and the Circassians. And F, the Cossacks were ecumenical and had good relations with the Jews and Muslims that they encountered within the Russian sphere of influence.
A and B seems to be right.
Yeah, B is certainly true.
Okay, so A and B.
A is too.
And F as well.
And I have in the comments E, so you got all 3 of them. Nice. Yeah, A, B, and E are the correct answers.
Yeah.
Doroshenko and Mazepa were opposed to alliances with the Russians. Cossacks were not Russian nobility, they were peasants. And F is false because they did not have good relations with Jews and Muslims. In fact, they persecuted both quite strenuously. All right, question number 2. Which of the following best explains the problem with the Ottoman decline thesis? A, the Ottoman Empire continued to expand after the death of Sultan Suleiman I and remained a dominating military presence. B, the Ottoman Empire maintained a strong economy, produced its own weapons, and became a bureaucracy. It's more that Europe advanced than that the Ottomans declined. C, the Ottoman Empire became one of the wealthiest states in the world by the end of the 18th century. Or D, the Ottoman decline thesis is older than current theories, and older theories are always wrong. I have a guess in the comments that it's B, and that's correct. The Ottoman Empire maintained a strong economy, produced its own weapons, and became a bureaucracy. As we pointed out with the economics, they were basically making the same kind of revenues in the middle of the 1700s towards the 1800s than before. I have somebody who went for the joke answer of D, that old theories are wrong because they're old. And C is false simply because we know that France and Britain were significantly wealthier than the Ottoman Empire by the end of the 18th century. And we also know that while there was some expansion after the death of Suleiman I, they did not remain a dominating military presence. And by the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, they were certainly on the back foot. They were on the defensive. All right, question number 3. Which of the following were the results of the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarja in 1774? Choose all that apply. A, the Crimean Khanate became nominally independent. B, Russia would acquire a lease for the port of Taganrog for 99 years. C, Russia would get a 4.5 million ruble indemnity. D, the Ottoman government renounced control of Kabardia. E, Russia would become the protector of the Ottoman Orthodox population. F, the Ottoman Empire would have to abolish slavery or stop purchasing Slavic slaves. G, the Ottoman Empire would be forbidden from rebuilding its navy. All right, I've got E in the comments. E is definitely correct. F is functionally correct, but it's not actually in the Treaty of Antwerp.
I think Russia became Orthodox long before 1700s.
Sure, but it's not whether Russia became Orthodox. It was that they would become the protector of the Orthodox population in the Ottoman Empire. It's that they had this extra national influence on the Orthodox outside of their own control. There are a couple other ones. Does anybody want to hazard a guess at what some of those other ones might be?
G.
I got A in the comments. A is correct. G is not correct. The Ottoman Empire was not forbidden from rebuilding its navy, and it actually attempted to do so. The Ottoman navy would never become anywhere near as powerful as it once was, but they did rebuild some of the ships. The other ones, A is correct. B is incorrect. Russia acquired that port through military conquest and retained it. There was no lease. C is correct. There was a 4.5 million ruble indemnity. D is correct. The Ottoman government renounced control of Kabardia, which effectively helped the Russians solidify their control of the Caucasus, at least the northern Caucasus. E is correct, as we pointed out. F is not in the treaty, but is functionally correct. And G is incorrect. All right. Question number 4. Which of the following explains the impressive Russian victories at the end of the 18th century? Choose all that apply. A, Russia produced incredibly astute politicians like Potemkin and generals like Suvorov. The Ottomans could not create a modern army until the Nizam-e-Jadid in the 19th century. The Russians were pioneering new kinds of artillery and guns that outmatched the Ottomans. The Janissary Corps often refused to engage the enemy, retreating at the first sight of danger. Despite Ottoman naval superiority, they could not launch effective amphibious assaults. The Russians knew that they could get intelligence and support from the Fanariotes. And G, the Russian Cossacks were a highly dynamic, irregular force in comparison to the Ottoman Sekban. I have a question of A, E, and G. G is correct and A is correct, but E is not. I've got C. C is also wrong. D is also wrong. The remaining answer is B. So it was A, B, and G are correct. The Russians did not have a significantly different type of arm or armament relative to the Ottomans at this time period. As we pointed out, their weapons production is relatively equal. What the Russians had was skill in terms of using these implements, which is why generals like Suvorov really made the difference here. The Janissary Corps often did engage the enemy. The Janissaries were known for their bravery, despite the fact that off the battlefield, they were involved in chicanery and other means of wealth generation, like racketeering and extortion. But in the military, they actually served quite well. They just weren't as effective because they weren't using modern techniques like drill. E is false because the Ottomans didn't have naval superiority. And in fact, the Russians were able to launch several effective amphibious assaults because they had that capability to launch amphibious assaults. And the Russians didn't know if they could get intelligence and support from the Fanariotes, but they did have lots of communication with them. Now, I have a comment that the Janissaries at one point rebelled against their masters. That's absolutely true. And we talked about that last time when Selim III was overthrown by the Janissaries and they appointed Mustafa IV as his successor. All right, question number 5. Which of the following best describes the situation in the Circassians in the 19th century? A, the Circassians were generally seen as a Caucasian people who would be loyal to the Russians due to their shared Christianity and fought against other Caucasians for Russia. Circassians had been displaced earlier from their homelands, and the 19th century saw a Russian policy of Circassian repatriation to the historic homelands of Adige and Kabardia. Circassians shifted from a strongly aristocratic style of government to a democracy before being defeated by the Russians and subject to a genocide and displacement. D. Circassians facilitated a long-term alliance between the Imam Shamil's Caucasian imamate and the Terek Cossacks so that both groups could stand up against Russian hegemony. And C is the correct answer. Well done in the comments, Patrick. Yeah, so first, there was a war in the early part of the 19th century within Circassia that shifted the country to a more egalitarian democratic government. Tikushuko, who we talked about last time, was responsible for, even though he was a noble, he sided with the poor and helped them win their democracy. But then in the 1860s, they were finally defeated by the Russians through all those battles in the Alls, right, those hill villages. And then from 1864 to 1867, they were subject to a genocide and displacement where at least 700,000 were killed and at least 700,000 were extirpated. Circassian numbers, Circassian counting on that tends to be higher. Most of those who were displaced made their way to the Ottoman Empire. A is false because the Circassians were either believers in the Khabze, which was an ancestral animistic belief, or they were Muslim. They were not Christian. And this description fits very well for the Ossetians, for some of the Vainakh people, for the Georgians and the Armenians. B is false because the Russians had not been repatriating Circassians. They were actually trying to expel them. This situation is much more similar to the situation of the Armenians who were repatriated during the 19th century. C is the correct answer, we pointed out. D is wrong because the Terek Cossacks were the Russian strike force used against the Circassians. They were not allies, they were enemies. But there was a functional alliance, if not an actual alliance, because of the split between the western side with the Circassians and the eastern side with the Caucasian imamate. While both these forces were opposing the Russians and they were both nominal allies, they couldn't actually exchange forces or armament. So anyway, I have a comment that Circassian paganism, or the Khabze, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and Sunni Islam were the three main religions of the Circassians. It's true, but Eastern Orthodoxy was significantly less represented than Khabze and Sunni Islam, Sunni Sufistic Islam. All right, now today, like last week, we're going to be talking about genocides and massacres. And to put it up there, right, when I talk about massacres, I'm talking about a killing of civilians without the attempt to exterminate. We're also going to see today several local genocides. And a local genocide is a case where governments that are local or irregulars, they're acting without some higher order or higher command, but they are acting with an attempt to exterminate. And they do perform acts of extermination. And then a state-led genocide, which we don't see today. But for example, the Circassian genocide was a state-led genocide, is a case where from the capital, you have leading bureaucrats who are officiating or organizing this genocide. We will see some of these kinds of genocides, massacres, local genocides, and the rest of it. I have a question about pogroms, whether they could be either state or local. Pogroms were almost always local. Because pogroms were, while the state often facilitated them, they were usually carried out by local militias. And so it's closer into either the massacre or the local genocide category. I would put it in the local genocide category if they were particularly successful. Now, as we mentioned, the Ottoman Empire was divided into this millet system. And in the millet system, non-Muslim minorities could exist, and they were represented by a leader of the millet. The original first three millets were the Jewish millet, the Rum millet, representing Greek Orthodoxy and other Orthodox Christianities, and the Millet Basha of the Armenians, who represented not just the Armenians, but also the Syriac Christians, the Coptic Christians, all of the Oriental Orthodox Christians, the non-Chalcedonian Christians. Now, starting in the 19th century, more and more millets are being created to cater to the increasing variety and diversity of the Ottoman Empire. But in many cases, the creation of these millets corresponds to the creation of some sort of national consciousness that occurs at a local level and is making its way, it's bubbling its way up to the Ottoman sultans, not the other way around. In many cases, these millets had been organized for hundreds of years at this point and had become a streamlined service for representing the needs of the people. Now, the thing, of course, is that millets, by dint of not being Muslim, were subject to a number of particular restrictions. As we mentioned, for example, public celebrations of religion were banned. The right to bear arms for people of minority groups was banned. Typically typically these people, while they may have worked together, didn't spend their social lives together. And in many cases, historic Christian churches had been converted into mosques. You can see the Naos Aion Apostolon, which is in the vicinity of Thessaloniki in Greece, which during the Ottoman period had been converted into a mosque, which was Sulksu Jami. And this was not a unique situation. Almost all of the domed cathedrals of the Orthodox world, including the holiest one, Hagia Sophia, which was the equivalent of the Orthodox Vatican, had been converted into mosques. And we also learned that there were a number of different districts that operated in Constantinople for these different minorities. Balat was the Jewish district, Fener was the Greek district, Kumkapa was the Armenian district, and the Greeks who lived in Fener, the Fanariotes, right, the people of Fener, were incredibly wealthy and able and prosperous because of the economy that they had promoted, which included Ottoman banks, which included shipping. If we're talking about the Fanariotes, if we're talking about the Amira class, who are Armenians, we have work in construction. Like you can see there, the Duzian, the Balyan were the chief imperial architects. We also have the directors of the imperial mint being from the Amira class, and Jews were primarily responsible for international commerce and trade, as well as banking as well. So I have a question about whether or not the millets had some form of self-governance, and that's absolutely the case. So the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Millet Basha of the Armenians, and the Millet Basha of the Armenians and the Chacham Basha of the Jews were all responsible for promoting the situation of their constituents. Accordingly, were able to create laws for those constituents. They had their own courts, they had their own legal systems into which they operated. Now, of course, if they had relations with a Muslim, be it in terms of trade, in terms of interpersonal relationships, anything like that, then those would be subject to the laws of the Ottoman state, the Muslim-led laws created by the Sheikhul Islam. But within their own millets, they were able to create their own laws. And that was one of the reasons, of course, why as we have religious fissioning in the Ottoman Empire, all of these religious minorities increasingly want their own millets to have their own legal abilities. So now I sort of want to explain what's going to happen for the next three presentations. Now, these three presentations sort of exist as a unity, and you can sort of think of it like the three parallel tracks in the Two Towers, if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings series. So you have, on the one hand, right, you have the Frodo track, you have the Pippin track, you have the Aragorn track, and you have characters that will weave between these different tracks like Gandalf. But generally speaking, these three people are operating in their own magisteria, but are somehow interconnected in terms of the large-scale goals names. And I debated with myself whether it would make more sense to go through it chronologically, and then we would keep jumping like you do in the movie, or do it more like in the books, where the Frodo story and the Aragorn story and the Pippin story are left pretty much individualized, and you sort of put them together later. And I think that separating them makes a lot more sense in terms of this presentation. That way it doesn't jump around as much, but I will refer to events that I'm going to discuss more in depth next week or the week following, because those presentations cover this same time period, which is from about 1800 to about 1878. And these three time periods these three basic issues are the Balkan revolutions, right, which we're covering today, Napoleon and Muhammad Ali Pasha, which takes place in Egypt, and the Tanzimat Ottomanism and Russo-Turkish wars, which take place in Constantinople. So, so I'm going to, and trust me, you're not going to be lost for detail. In fact, as we're getting closer and closer to modernity, there's more information, there's more complexity that we're aware of, and so the story will get even thornier, which again underlined my decision to split this up. So, all right, so I'm not as happy with this map from 1861 as I would otherwise like. I wish I had a map from earlier in the Ottoman Empire, but this is the best I could do to show the ethnic mixing within the Ottoman Empire, even as late as 1861. So you can see that, for example, Greeks, who are represented in the blue color, exist not only in the region of Thessalia here, or the region of Epirus here, or in the region of Macedonia, all of these regions which are part of modern day Greece, but they also exist in Eastern Thrace, which is a part of modern Turkey, all along the Turkish Aegean coast. You have Greeks even here in what's now Bulgaria. These red areas are majority Turkish, and you can see that the northeastern corner of what's today Bulgaria was majority Turkish. You have some populations here that were a different kind of Turk that had settled in Moldavia. You have Bulgaro-Slavic populations all the way through what's now North Macedonia into northern Greece. You've got Albanian populations, some of them are here in Kosovo. You have these black areas, which are Aromanian populations, which are related to the Romanians. So you've got, and in this map, it doesn't even show the distinctions between Bosnians, Croats, and Serbs, which if you did see it, it would look even more messy than the map from 1992, where that actually is delimited, with the Bosniaks, the Muslims, being in brown, the Croats in sort of the dark green, and the Serbs being in sort of the chartreuse yellowish green. Right, so it was even more, and in the modern map, the sort of the pinkish gray areas are areas that are too well mixed to even define. There's a question about the difference between the Bulgars and the Serbs. You can sort of see where my cursor is here. This is sort of the dividing line. Everything to the west of that is Serbs. Everything to the east of that is Bulgars. So that's the distinction there. But the map from 1992 has a lot more specificity, and also we have the result of one of the things that we're going to see partially today and partially when we get to the Balkan Wars in several weeks, which is that we had numerous campaigns of ethnic cleansing and intentional massacres designed to ethnically unify people within one set of borders. So there's a reason why on the modern map, the ethnicities pretty much match the borders of the countries. There are some small exceptions, like the northwestern corner of northern Macedonia, or the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there are specific reasons why those states are mixed. But for the most part, we're going to have a lot of attempts to remove minority ethnic groups who happen to be in a new nation state. And I have a comment that the 1861 map is after the 1821 revolution in Greece. That's absolutely correct, which is why the regions of Attica, Boeotia, and the Peloponnesos are not represented on this map, because they were part of independent Greece, and the map is about the Ottoman Empire. I also have a question. Is the yellow area in the northeast of Albania, is that Kosovo? Yes, some of it is. This area is Kosovo, and on this map, this area is Kosovo. All right. So we also mentioned that certain aspects of Serbian nationalism that date back very, very early. For example, this was during the Long Turkish War, which was 1591 to 1606. This was the reign of Mehmet III. For those of you who don't have a quasi-eidetic memory, this was during our Sultanate of Women discussion. Sultan Mehmet III was one of those sultans, and Koca Sinan Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier at the time, was dealing with a number of Serbian revolts throughout the country. And to deal with those revolts, he decided to go after their symbology. Most of these Serbs had rallied behind the flag of Saint Sava, Saint Sava being one of the first Serbians to convert to Orthodox Christianity and therefore help found the Serbian Orthodox Church. So now that they had the flag of Saint Sava, in order to crush the rebellion, Koca Sinan Pasha unearthed the bones of Saint Sava that had been buried, and he set them on fire in this great bonfire. You can see recounted in this Serbian painting, and it was an attempt to, through the physical destruction of his body, the spiritual destruction of the Serbian people. Now, one point I also want to make is that the Serbian Orthodox Church was an autocephalous church. It was self-governing, but it was self-governing under the Patriarch of Constantinople. So in terms of their organization within the Ottoman Empire, they did not have a separate millet. They were part of the Orthodox Rum millet and responsible to the Patriarch of Constantinople. That said, they had their own unique liturgy, and Serbians tended to identify each other as Serbians through their unity in the church. One of the other things that we sort of need to talk about is that as a result of the wars that the Habsburgs had fought with the Ottoman Empire, the Serbs had been caught up in these wars and generally fought alongside the Habsburgs in some attempt to try and reclaim their homeland. Remember that Serbia was part of the Ottoman territories starting in the mid-1500s with Suleiman the Great's destruction of Hungary, the Hungarian Empire. We also need to take into account that the modern country of Serbia is composed of sort of three major regions. You have this region in the center, and this region in the center is historic Serbia. You have this region in the south, which includes Kosovo and is known as Kosovo and Metohija, which is the origin of the Serbian people and the Serbian church, but was not where most Serbians lived. Most Serbians lived in this central region. And then you have this region to the north, which was called the Vojvodina. And at this point in history, the Vojvodina did not have that many Serbs in it. It was mostly Hungarians, Romanians who lived there, and some German speakers. I have a question about the reference of saints. If I use the word saint, it should be in reference to an Orthodox or Catholic saint, yes. If I refer to a Sufi saint, then I usually don't use the term saint, because that's usually just an English mistranslation of the Sufi words for master or leader, like Pir. So as a result of these wars that they fought with the Habsburgs, you begin to see a migration from the area south of Belgrade, that central Serbian area, further north into the Habsburg Empire. So you have people like Patriarch Arsenia III Czarnojevic, and he would lead these great migrations of Serbs. And so you'd have large trails of people coming into the Habsburg territories. Now, I put the modern boundaries sort of haphazardly onto this older map, but you can see that when the people left what is now Serbia, they entered into the western part of what is now Hungary and the northern part of what is now Serbia. And they began to settle in large communities there. The patriarch came to these areas and actually made this the new center of the Serbian world. And these great migrations occurred twice, the first time in 1690 and the second time in 1737, leading to a massive change in where Serbians were the majority. The Vojvodina, that northern portion, didn't have, as I pointed out, many Serbs prior to these great migrations, but as a result of them, they become Serbian majority. Now, one thing that we should also point out is that we had this Austro-Russian-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739. And that war, the Austrians had a Serbian contingent that came with them. That Serbian contingent ended up fighting on the Austrian side and winning several victories. In fact, they were able to push rather deep into Ottoman territory. However, after losing the Battle of Grocka, the Austrians completely abandoned their Serbian allies, and the Serbian territory was taken completely over by the Ottoman state. And as a result, Serbians underwent that second great migration that we pointed out, and also began to seriously distrust that the Austrians could ever really bring about their yearning for independence once again. Now, I have a question about whether the patriarchs of the Serbian Orthodox Church were seeking out areas to create a majority population, and the answer is no. They were looking for areas to settle. It just happened that the areas that they settled in were not densely populated, and accordingly, that Serbian population that moved in effectively became a new majority. So you can see, for example, if we sort of narrow down into this Austro-Turkish War, that you had this large kingdom of Serbia that was in most of that central region from 1718 to 1739, and you had leaders like Vuk Isakovic, who led these Serbian militias with the blessing of the patriarchs of the Serbian Orthodox Church. But even as they were serving in the Habsburg army, they would continually be reprimanded for being schismatics or heretics, as the Hungarians would, as the Austrians would call them, because from the Austrian perspective, these were non-Catholics, and therefore, while they were Christian, they were the wrong type of Christian. And this, of course, bred resentment that compounded the physical loss of territory that resulted from the Austrians losing the Austro-Turkish War. The ascension of Russia in the war of 1768 to 1774 fundamentally changed the politics here, because now Russia, through this ability to be seen as the protector of the Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, they now had a connection to the Serbs, being that Orthodox population. And their victories in this war helped to galvanize the Serbians in an even stronger way towards seeking independence and towards a greater alliance with Russia, forsaking the Austrians as their benefactor. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, it wasn't just the Russians and the Turks fighting. We covered that last week. The Austrians were also involved. And at this same time, we have Serbian forces in the Austrian military, and these are called the Freikorps. And the Freikorps was led by a Serbian named Kocha Anđelković, and Kocha Anđelković led another attempt to liberate Serbia from the Ottomans, and you can see that they controlled a significant portion of Serbian territory, still not a large state, but they were able to advance quite successfully, especially in comparison to the rest of the Austrian army, which was not able to score many successive victories against the Ottomans, despite the Ottomans being fully destroyed by the Russians. But in order to get out of the war, because the Austrians had other issues on their other borders, they abandoned the Serbians once again. And so this would be the final and last time that the Serbians would even consider working with the Austrians. And there was a great antipathy that really built up between those Serbs south of Belgrade who kept trying to fight for independence. As these territories came back under Ottoman authority, you had Selim III, and Selim III had a number of reforms against the Janissaries during this period, which led to those Janissaries fleeing northwards into the Balkans, where he would have less control over them. And these kinds of Janissaries were called Dahia, which is sort of a loose term for uncle and a loose term for bullies, because that's pretty much what they were. They controlled the territory from the perspective of trying to maximize its rents. They were terribly oppressive. And so you had these Dahia even assassinating Haji Mustafa Pasha, who was the governor of the province as appointed by Selim III, in order to more effectively rule over the territory. In addition, one of the concessions that Selim III had to make was that the Serbians would be allowed to have some minor form of self-governance. And that minor form of self-governance would be that below the Ottoman governors would be a number of oberknyes, or under princes. And these under princes would be responsible for large amounts of Serbian territory, and these oberknyes were ethnic Serbians. And they were Christian as well. For example, you can see in this picture Aleksa Nenadovic. He was one of these oberknyes. There were usually 3 or 4 at the same time, controlling different districts of what was historically Serbia. That said, it wasn't a really peaceful or ecumenical situation. And so the Dahia seeked support from other leaders in the Balkans, like Osman Pasvantolu. He was a local governor in what is now Bulgaria. And so he began to declare war in an attempt to take over Serbia. The Serbs, by contrast, rallied behind one Serbian prince. He wasn't an oberknyes, but he was from a historically powerful family, and that's Karađorđe, or Black George. And he becomes a Serbian national hero, trying to fight for the liberation of Serbia, starting in 1804, as this war gets bigger and bigger in the aftermath of the assassination of Haji Mustafa Pasha. And so in 1804, Karađorđe brings together a number of the oberknyes and other Serbian nobles in what's called the Orshats Assembly, and the Orshats Assembly decides that Karađorđe will lead the Serbian people forward and on to victory in the creation of a new Serbian emirate. And Karađorđe is actually very militarily successful. In 1806, he takes the city of Belgrade, because he had started in the mountainside and the countryside, which was the hardest for the Ottomans to control. But in 1806, as I said, he captures Belgrade, and when he gets there, he massacres pretty much every Turk he can get his hands on. And when I say Turk, I don't just mean Muslim. He targeted Jewish populations as well, and we'll see this as a recurrent theme, that because the Jews are considered to have been loyal to the Ottoman sultans, which is historically accurate, they were persecuted along with the Muslims that they would find. And you can see, this is a Serbian painting on the left-hand side, and you can see the Muslims, the Turks, being killed by Karađorđe's successful forces. Karađorđe also manages to link up with Mikhail Kutuzov, who is the Russian general fighting Napoleon and the Ottoman Empire at this point, because after the Battle of Austerlitz, Selim III had renewed his alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which meant that France was necessarily an enemy of the Ottomans. And because of the Russian-Serbian connection through that orthodoxy, Kutuzov launched a number of attacks in conjunction with Karađorđe, even though the two never actually met up on the battlefield. Then there's the Skull Tower of Niš, which is a particularly sad or harrowing story. One of the Serbian defenders was in a position where his forces were being overwhelmed by the Ottomans. What he decided to do in order to avoid the victory was that he shot right into a powder keg and exploded not only the powder keg, killing his own forces, but he killed almost the entire Ottoman army as well. And the Ottomans, in anger over the amount of dead that had resulted from this intentional act of I guess you could call it war terrorism, although, yeah, actually built a tower with the skulls of the Serbians, and it still stands at Niš. This is from this is a live picture. In order to basically threaten the Serbians with more death should they continue revolting. There's a question of whether standardized transliterations of these various names exist. When it comes to Serbian names, all of these names are the standard transliteration, because Serbian and Croatian, Croatian is written with the Latin alphabet, Serbian is written with the Cyrillic alphabet. they have a one-to-one equivalence, with one exception, which is the letter LJ. But they have a one-to-one equivalence. So if you actually look up, for example, Orashats, with that exact same spelling, O-R-A-she, se, you will find this information. When we get to the Greeks, the spellings are relatively consistent in English. So I've used those. When we get to the Arabs, then it gets all funky because then those spellings are not consistent in English at all. But within the Balkans, all the spellings that I use, you can find. Now, the Russians signed the Treaty of Bucharest in 1812, ending their war with the Ottoman Empire, which puts the first Serbian uprising on dangerous footing because now the Ottoman Empire can focus all of its attention on the Serbs. That said, after Karađorđe had conquered Belgrade in 1806, the Ottoman Empire had sent him numerous missives asking if he would accept autonomy in exchange for putting down arms. And Karađorđe absolutely refused. He would accept only autonomy or, only independence or capitulation. And so the Ottoman Empire, refusing to allow the area to become independent, would eventually defeat it, and Karađorđe fled into Austria, and from Austria made his way to Russia, to the city of Odessa, which is now in modern Ukraine, but was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And he stayed there for a while. We'll sort of catch up with him in a bit. While he was in Odessa, he swore loyalty to the Filikiateria, and the Filikiateria was a secret society of individuals who were interested in promoting the Orthodox independences in the Balkans. We're talking about the independence of Romania, the independence of Bulgaria, the independence of Greece, the independence of Serbia. The Filikiateria, of course, you can hear by the name that it's a Greek name. But it was founded in Odessa by the Russians as a way to promote Orthodox power within the Balkans and an extension of Russian power into the Balkans through these independent states. Now, as I said, Karađorđe became a member of this Filikiateria, which means friendly society in English. And the Filikiateria began to send spies into these territories to try and promote this sort of independence. At this same time, the first Serbian uprising ended in 1813. In 1815, the Ottoman recriminations against the Serbians for having fought in the uprising were so unbearable that another uprising started almost immediately, and this time it was led by Miloš Obrenović. He had the conference at Takovo in 1815, at which he had this his famous phrase, "I am here, you are here, death to the Turks," where he organized a rebellion against the Turks, and the Turks realized that they couldn't put down another rebellion in such a short amount of time. And so they asked if Miloš Obrenović would accept the terms that Karađorđe had rejected, those terms being for that the Serbians would have an autonomous principality within the Ottoman Empire, but would not achieve independence. And Miloš Obrenović accepted those terms. Now, at the same time, Karađorđe was himself assassinated. So the story of that is that he was snuck into Serbia by the Filikiateria, but he was betrayed by one of his erstwhile Serbian allies and stabbed on the orders of Miloš Obrenović, who was afraid of losing power to this other Serbian leader, Karađorđe. It ends up happening that Miloš Obrenović's successors are assassinated themselves in 1842 to empower the successors of Karađorđe, whose descendants become the royal rulers of Serbia. One of the interesting things that we should point out is the Candlemas Constitution of 1835. Now, one of the things that had been going on since the French Revolution was the codification of constitutions for different states within the within the world. And this was a direct anathema to the more conservative tradition of the monarchs, which were absolute rulership without these binding documents. Because what does a constitution do but limit the power of the sovereign with respect to the population and gives clear rules of behavior that the sovereign has to follow. The creation of this constitution in 1835 was a symbol of the liberalism that undergirded the Serbian Revolution, at least by 1835. But it was quickly replaced within less than a year because the Austrians and the Turks both refused to allow the Serbians to have a constitution because that might create increased desires among their own populations for similar constitutions that would constrain their authority and power. Now, when it comes to creating a national identity, we have to realize that the concept of ethnicity, although we think of it as a formalized and ossified structure, is actually not the case. Ethnicity is something that is created, is something that is lived, is something that is emotionally connected to. And so we have individuals who are responsible for the creation of the Serbian national identity. The two most important ones are Dositej Obradović, you can see on the left-hand side, and Vuk Karadžić, you can see on the right-hand side. Now, Obradović was really famous for the codification of the Serbian language, because one of the things that we have to realize is that the dialects that people spoke and the way that people communicated was not the way that they had written. The language of the Serbian Orthodox Church was Old Church Slavonic, which was a language that hadn't been spoken for nearly 400 years at this point, right? You can think of it almost like Shakespearean English versus the way that we speak English today. But today we have numerous language societies that codify and organize the way we spell and write English. In fact, the fights between these societies are the hilarity between, does the word color have a U in it, right? These sort of fractious debates. Obradović actually sat down with the Cyrillic alphabet and created a Cyrillic alphabet for the Serbian language. And in fact, the Cyrillic alphabet that the Serbians used has been expanded to be used for Bulgarian and other Balkans Slavic languages. But it's important to note that they have letters in their alphabet that don't exist in the native Cyrillic alphabet. Like, for example, if you go to Russia, you'll see that several of the letters that exist in Serbian, like the letter che, like the letter Lje, don't exist in Russian. And it was the creation of this that allowed Obradović to then begin to articulate through literature. He wrote an immense amount of poetry and stories and nonfiction sort of demographic literature, the Serbian language. And more or less what Obradović wrote down about 150, 200 years ago is the modern Serbian language. Vuk Karadžić was much more on the emotional side of Serbian identity. He went to the various local towns and principalities and found out what the commoners' lives were like. And he wrote down the folk tales and the common stories that tended to bring Serbian people together to create this sort of national ethos, this national identity that built on a Serbian culture independent of the Ottoman domination and to a certain extent independent of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Though, of course, the Serbian Orthodox Church in Karadžić's mind was something that was incredibly important to the identity of the Serbian people. And these two people are honored today. You can see this is the Museum of Vuk and Dositej. I think it was originally, this was originally Dositej Obradović's house. And it's in Belgrade, Serbia. And it's a devotion to this creation of the Serbian national identity. Now, it wasn't just the Serbs who were getting these ideas towards independence and motivation. Another member of Veliki Eteria was Alexandros Ypsilantis, and Ypsilantis was Greek. He was a fanariot, meaning that he came from that wealthy class in Istanbul, Greeks who were in Istanbul and therefore served the Ottoman Sultan. But a lot of them were people who spoke multiple languages, and that was the way that they contributed to the Ottoman Empire. Remember, all of the dragomans that we talked about, those translators for documents, were almost always fanariot, were always these Greek Orthodox living in Istanbul, and therefore they had access to the French documentation concerning the Enlightenment and the development of a modern ethnicity. So Alexandros Ypsilantis becomes a member of Filikieteria and decides to cross the Prut River into Moldavia and conquer Moldavia, for want of a better term, with Russian support. At the same time, there's another member of the Fanariot who's ethnically Romanian. Remember, the Fanariot are Greek Orthodox, but that doesn't mean that they're ethnically Greek necessarily. So you have Tudor Vladimirescu, who was Fanariot, but he was also Romanian ethnically. And he starts another rebellion in the western part of Wallachia, and the two of them meet in the city of Bucharest. Unfortunately for them, their rebellion was significantly less organized than anything the Serbs had put forward. And even the Serbs had difficulty organizing all their different divisions. We saw the conflict between Obrenović and Karađorđe. In this case, it was less a conflict between Vladimirescu and Ypsilantis than it was between their various forces being completely unorganized, beginning to raid and pillage, and the revolution sort of fell apart when the Ottoman soldiers came in from the south and the Russian soldiers came in from the north. The rebellions were quashed, and the status quo was brought back. That said, it was much harder to put the genie back into the bottle of these new uprisings and identities because of these acts. Ypsilantis famously, when he withdrew from Moldavia, said, "Speak not to me of these soldiers. I never saw a soldier in my life. They all fled at the sound of guns." Yeah, he sort of lost his faith in the ability to acquire power through war. That said, he still continued, literarily speaking, to promote the idea of a free and independent Greece. So it's really important for us to understand Grecian geography and Grecian history during the Ottoman period in order to understand where the revolution came from. So if you look at the map, you can see that Greece is an incredibly mountainous country, and the mountains cut wide swaths of Greece separate from other swaths of Greece. So control of the mountains is critical if you want to maintain control of Greece. And historically, you had two groups of mountainous soldiers who would fight and lived in these areas. You had the Klefts and you had the Armatolos. Now, both of these people lived in mountain areas. They extorted people in the valleys for wealth, and in turn protected shipments going through. The only functional difference that I could seem to find between a Kleft and an Armatolos is that an Armatolos was somehow in the employ of the Ottoman Empire, whereas a Kleft remained semi-independent or autonomous in terms of his actions. But there were many cases where Klefts would render services to the Ottomans and become Armatolos, or Armatolos would, after getting paid, would squander that payment and then become Klefts again. It was very difficult for the Ottomans to maintain control in the south of Greece. It looks like a peninsula, and originally it was, but it is now an island with a small canal that cuts through here. But at that point, it was still a peninsula. And for example, these little fingerlings, especially this one here called Mani, were full of Klefts and very difficult for the Ottomans to maintain control over. In many cases, they would just give autonomy to these Klefts and try to control the lowland regions that were more agriculturally productive. And these Klefts had been mobilized in war before. If we remember from last week, Catherine had this project, this Greek project that she called it, where she was going to divide the Balkans between her son, Potemkin, and the Austrians. And part of that involved the General Orlov arriving in Greece and motivating the Klefts to fight on his behalf. And you can see blue arrows on that map. All those blue arrows are Kleft movements fighting the Ottomans. The red are the Ottomans trying to fight them back, and the green are the Russians. You can even see the Battle of Cheshme, which was a Russian naval battle in 1770 that prevented the Ottomans from directly resupplying their forces in Greece. Of course, the Orlov revolt was unsuccessful. Greece remained under Ottoman control after the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarca. But this showed that the Klefts were perfectly capable of fighting a revolution against the Ottomans if given the proper incentives, if given the proper organization. So in the same way that the Serbian culture was a creation of modernity, so was the modern Greek culture. And the first person that really sort of gives a clear voice to this is Rigas Feraios. He lived for a time in what is now Romania. And then he moved to Vienna. And in Vienna, he became acquainted with the ideas of the French Revolution. He became acquainted with the ideas of nationalism, and he began to write a Greek newspaper that began to proclaim the values of an independent Greek state. It is upon those sort of ideas that Filiki Eteria would eventually become based, right? He was not responsible for its creation. It was created after he died. But those ideas of Greek nationalism based on this idea of shared culture and heritage, the Greek language, the Greek Orthodox Church, all of these, the styles of dress and talk and speech. And so that began to crystallize. But there became a serious question as to what elements the Greek identity had. And one of the foremost of these, again, was language. One of the major problems is that there are many iterations of the Greek language. And if we compare the Greek of Homer to what Greeks speak today, the two are mutually unintelligible. They are related languages, but you can similarly compare between Old English and Modern English, where if you pick up Beowulf, right, and you're reading it in Old English, you'll struggle mightily unless you actually know Old English. And there was a lot of conservative pressure, especially from the Greek Orthodox Church, to keep the language more ancestral, more pure, and there was more pressure from the people to implement what was called demotiki. Demotiki being the language of the people. Demos is people, demotiki the language of the people. And so Adamantios Korais, he wanted to try and bridge that gap. And so he as a literary scholar who had lived, he was a Greek ethnically, and he was born in Smyrna in what's now Turkey. But he lived most of his life in Paris, in Amsterdam, in Western European cities, where he became much more acquainted with other places and other styles of thinking. He spoke 4 languages fluently in addition to his native Greek. And he worked on trying to bridge the gap between Homeric Greek, between Koine, which is the popular Greek that was spoken about 2,000 years ago, like the New Testament of the Bible is written in Koine, as opposed to Homeric Greek, and the Greek that the people spoke in the current day, Demotiki, and the Greek of the liturgical situation. So he had all 4 of those different Greek languages that he was puzzling together between, and he came up with a language called Katharevousa, which became the formal Greek language. Katharevousa was the language of the Greeks of Greece pretty much until the 1970s and 1980s. And Katharevousa was formal enough for the Fanariot and all of the church leaders to agree that it was up to the standard of a Greek language, but close enough to Demotiki that most people could understand it, even if they couldn't speak it perfectly well. And so by bridging that gap, he really created a sense of modern Greek identity as shaped by a unitary language that at least most people could understand and connect with, and a literature that could be produced in that language that people would connect to. Adamantios Korais is known for writing numerous different books and poems about Greece. Rigas Feraios, in addition to writing his newspaper, had also written several poems, both of them galvanizing the Greek spirit, that the Greeks should return. Feraios is quite famous for rendering a Greek version of La Marseillaise in order to try and rouse their spirits. And so, not long after this Greek consciousness and immediately following Ypsilantis' failed invasion of Romania, you have Greeks Greeks in what is now Attica and Boeotia in central in central Greece, beginning the Greek Revolution. And you can see this is an army of klefts in front of Bishop Germanos in Old Patras. And this is the famous moment where it's believed that the Greek Revolution began. You can see that they're swearing loyalty to the flag, and the flag is being blessed by the bishop, showing a clear connection between the religious element of their Greek identity and the secular element of their Greek identity. Mahmud II, who was Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was thoroughly outraged by this declaration of independence and several of the battles that have begun to occur in the Peloponnesos. We're going to talk about those in a few minutes, that he actually executed the Patriarch Gregorios V in Istanbul on Easter, on Orthodox Easter, which was incredibly infuriating and galvanized support for the Greek cause, especially in the Russian Empire, where it was seen as particularly outrageous to kill the Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, while there were fanariot like Ypsilantis, like the Mavrocordatos family that we're going to talk about a little bit, who supported the Greek Revolution, the majority of the fanariotes gained their privileges through the Ottoman system, and so they didn't support the revolution. Gregorios V himself, that executed Patriarch, had told the Greeks not to revolt, arguing that it was better for them to stay in the Ottoman Empire. And in many cases, with regards to the privileges that they had, they could stand to lose those. And so the majority of fanariotes did not support the revolution. You can see in the lower right-hand side, this is Spiridon Mavrogenis. He was very young during the time of the Greek Revolution. He was a boy, but he represents the majority of fanariotes who actually didn't support the revolution. And Spiridon Mavrogenis was actually the chief surgeon to Sultan Abdulhamid II in his later life. So there were so fanariotes who remained loyal to the empire still were able to achieve high positions, even though many of them were seen as disloyal, despite their non-support of the Greek independence and their attempted loyalty to the Sultan. That said, this loyalty to the Sultan didn't earn them any favors with the Greeks rebelling in the Peloponnesos, who considered them traitors and disloyal Greeks who were no better than the Turks that they were trying to overthrow. And so you have a number of these battles throughout the Peloponnesos that result in quick Greek victories against Ottoman garrisons, and oftentimes not just garrisons, but local towns. When we get to this point in 1821, we have a number of reciprocal local genocides, both by the Greek side and by the Turkish side. On the Greek side, we have the massacre at Tripolitsa. The Greeks besieged the city of Tripolitsa. They had been able, because the majority of the revolutionaries were klefts and armatoloi, they were in control of the mountains. The Turks controlled the cities. Now, when Tripolitsa was taken, the Greeks made it to slaughter every Turk that they could find. It's estimated that 20,000 were killed, and we have horrendous stories from the Greeks themselves about what they did when they encountered the Turks there. And by the way, again, Turks here refers to both Muslims and Jews. The Greeks did not discriminate between non-Greeks, considering them all loyal to the Ottoman state. We have cases written by, as I said, written by the Greeks where they were cooking people's flesh. We have cases where people were, boasting about killing 90 Turks. Women were gutted. All of these kinds of horrendous things. And on the flip side, we have the island of Chios, which is an island close to Anatolia. It was a completely ethnically Greek island, and the Turks led an invasion of that island in response to these revolts, and killed over 50,000 people and enslaved about another 50,000 on that island. It's estimated that only a few thousand in population remained on Chios after the massacre. again, the same sorts of things. Greeks were killed in large numbers. It was incredibly brutal. You can see this particular painting was by Delacroix to inspire the French to take pity on the Greeks for the horrendous atrocity that they were suffering. Both of these should be considered local genocides, in addition to the numerous other massacres that are similar in scope and standard to what we see at Tripolitsa and at Chios from both the Greek and the Turkish sides. I have a comment here that the execution of Gregory V also led to many of the first Greek anti-Jewish pogroms, and that's correct. It was believed that the Jews were responsible for throwing Gregory V's body into the sea. Whether or not they actually were is unclear. But in Odessa, where his body was recovered and buried, there was a pogrom against the Jews of the city for the crime of having desecrated the body of Gregory V. Yeah. Now, after 1821, from 1821 to 1825, the Turks are sort of out of the picture, more or less. They do send in militaries to try and reclaim the Peloponnesos, reclaim Athens as well, because Athens has now fallen into Greek hands, but they are really out of the picture. For the most part, between 1822 and 1825, you have different fights between the Greek leaders themselves. The only thing that united them was the liberation of Greece from the Ottomans. Beyond that, they didn't share much in common. And so you had leaders like Theodoros Kolokotronis, who was a chief general, especially in the eastern part of the Peloponnesos, and he led a number of different military cleft units. And you had more diplomatic leaders like Alexandros Mavrokordatos, who didn't like the sort of violent and aggressive methods that people like Kolokotronis were using in order to control the countryside. Kolokotronis, by contrast, would say that Mavrokordatos was being too flowery and not taking into consideration the actual needs to secure victory. There were 3 different Greek civil wars during this period that resulted in a diminution of Greek power and an eventual lessening of the ability of the Greeks to continue onwards in terms of what their other liberation goals were, just, for example, like Boeotia and Thessalia. So, despite sending in all of these armies, the Ottomans discover that they cannot stop the Greek rebellion, and so they reach out to Egypt. Now, Egypt at this point has become an autonomous vassal state under Muhammad Ali Pasha. We're going to discuss that entire process next week. It's a very involved process. But suffice it to say that Egypt has its own military, and it's a military that has, it has its own navy, and this military has been built with French advisors. You can see the French advisors in the picture of Muhammad Ali Pasha in front of his navy. And he sends this naval fleet, which is composed of 52 modern warships, to Greece in order to put down the rebellion. The Egyptian forces are led by Ibrahim Pasha, Muhammad Ali Pasha's son, and you can see him riding over at the Battle of Missolonghi. There were 3 distinct sieges of Missolonghi, but eventually Ibrahim Pasha was able to overcome the Greek defenses. The battle that the Egyptians lost was against the Maniot, these people of the southwestern portion of the Peloponnesos. And Mani, as I said, was one of the regions that was so difficult to conquer that even the Ottomans would usually give them autonomy. And for those of you who sort of know a little bit of history, Mani is in the area of Laconia, which is the historic area of Sparta. So you could almost see that sort of recurrent sense of nationalism, of course, that the Spartans were the ones who were able to survive, whereas the rest of Greece fell to the Egyptians. The 3rd siege of Missolonghi, of course, was where Lord Byron, the famous British dandy and Hellenophile, was killed. Well, he died of disease, but that's the dying blow. Now, when the Egyptians came up, the Russians tried to convince the English and the French to intervene on the side of the Greeks in order to liberate them. Especially because if they didn't, Russia was going to stretch out her hand. The British didn't want the Russians to have that much control over Greece, so they eyed the situation very warily. That said, they received one piece of information that sort of tipped the scales and was leaked to the public. And it's this, that Dorothy Lievin, the wife of the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom, told Canning, who was a British diplomat, that they had positive information that an agreement was entered into by the Porte, meaning the Ottoman Sultan and the Pasha of Egypt, to remove the whole Greek population, carrying them off into slavery in Egypt or elsewhere, and to repeople the country with Egyptians and others of the Mohammedan religion. Now, when this became public, Britain's hands were basically tied in that they would have to go to war with the Egyptians, force them out of Greece, and prevent this barbarization, this turning of Greece into a land full of barbarians, and the deportation of all the Greeks. It's unclear whether or not any such agreement was entered into. We have no documents that support it, but at the same time, the Ottomans and Egyptians never denied it. So by, So yeah, this is just a map of how powerful Egypt was by this point. They had conquered significant amounts of territory, and again, we'll discuss this next time. So we have the British finally making their involvement more direct in the Battle of Navarino, which we talked about last time, and the Ottoman state is required to recognize the independence of the First Hellenic Republic, and you can see that it occupies the southern portions of what is today Greece. Now, the Hellenic Republic is led by a man named Ioannis Kapodistrias. Kapodistrias was actually very famous at this time because he had been a foreign minister of Russia, serving in their bureaucracy, and he had been the principal opponent to Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian prince at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. He was a very adroit statesman and was considered, and had his family was a Fanariot family before they moved to Russia. And Ioannis Kapodistrias tried to organize the Greek state. He was famous for working from 5 in the morning until 10 at night every day to try and build Greece. He sanctioned invasions of Thessaly, which you can see added to the territory of Greece in the dark green. He got the British to give him the Ionian Islands, and he launched invasions of Crete. Those invasions of Crete, of course, were unsuccessful. And he was able to maintain authority through a strong alliance with Kolokotronis, that sort of very aggressive Peloponnesian general, even though a lot of Greek notables were angry with him. In one particular situation, we had his assassination in 1831 at the hands of Maniot, who were angry that he had investigated their leader, Petrobe, of corruption. And after he was stabbed, you had a period of short anarchy in Greece before the world powers decided instead to bring King Otto I, a Bavarian monarch, a Bavarian prince, to be king of Greece, and therefore, because he wasn't connected to any of the regions of Greece, he would be somewhat more independent. You can also see in the upper right-hand side the city of Idra, which is where Kapodistrias had some of his greatest difficulties in controlling the population, and you had revolts there at several points. All right. But not all the revolutions were progressive. We also have regressive revolutions. So in 1826, Mahmud II performs the Auspicious Incident. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. And the Auspicious Incident basically removes the Janissaries as a part of the Ottoman Empire and results in the elimination of the Ion, or the local princes in the various territories, who would be governors and would instead result in new governors being appointed from Istanbul in accordance with these modernization reforms. I couldn't find a map of the Bosnia eyalet from this time period, but you can sort of imagine these two maps. One is of modern Bosnia and one is of the Bosnia eyalet from 1683. And so basically, if it's in the territory of one of those, it's in the Bosnia eyalet, but it's not. But neither of them is exactly the right border. And this territory was under the control of Hussein Gradaščević, and Gradaščević had a number of local notables that were under him, and these reforms, combined with the fact that that Principality of Serbia that was created for Miloš Obrenović, included some of the territory that was historically Bosnian. He decided to revolt against these new reforms and secure more power for himself and other fellow Bosnian notables. Hussein Gradaščević and all of these notables were Muslims, and his center of command was this Gradačac fortress that you can see renovated here. The uprising was put down in 1832, just outside of Sarajevo. And the important takeaway here is that all different parties in the Ottoman Empire were trying to declare independence. And the creation of a Bosnian state here had nothing to do with the creation of a national identity or the development of a Bosnian consciousness. That's not what happened here at all. This is a retrenchment that's also happening at the same time. So you have these, so it's much messier than just the Balkans is just going in one direction. One of the interesting things is that for the majority of history, this period of Bosnian history was relatively repressed. It was only when you have the creation of the Bosniak ethnicity, the development of that in the 1980s and 1990s as a result of the wars that divided Yugoslavia, that Gradaščević becomes a symbol of Bosnian nationalism and Bosniak identity, right? Bosniaks being the Muslim speakers of the same Serbo-Croatian language that the Serbs and Croats speak. And I keep saying these liberals and conservatives, so I feel like I should flesh out a little bit what the differences are about what's going on here in this time period. So we have the conservatives, and the conservatives want to maintain the status quo, but what does that mean functionally? They want no written constitutions because empowering citizens would be chaos. The absolute monarchy was a system that had survived for a very long time. It was a stable system, it was a functional system, and that stability allows everybody to achieve economic prosperity. And so those kinds of monarchies, aristocracies, and churches, to the extent that they coalesce this sort of historic power, should be maintained, and the system shouldn't be changed in any meaningful way. The liberals, by contrast, wanted a written constitution that would delimit rights and privileges, protect freedom of thought and speech and religion. They wanted a bourgeoisie that would be empowered, not necessarily a landed elite or a church elite. And so you have this massive friction between these liberal impulses and these conservative impulses. And that comes to a head in the revolutions of 1848. Now, this was a massive development that occurred all across Europe. You have riots in Paris, which overthrow the kingdom and replace it with the Second Republic of France. You have revolts in Germany, which, while initially successful, are later crushed. You have revolts in Hungary. You have all these different revolts you can see on the right-hand side, 17 different insurrections all across Europe in 1848. And of course, the Balkans is not spared this, even though the majority of the Balkans under the Ottoman Empire doesn't go through this. The parts that are part of Hungary do. And so what ends up happening is that you have Lajos Kossuth and a number of other Hungarian leaders leading a reclamation of the Hungarian crown lands, the creation of a Hungarian monarchy. Now, the Hungarian crown lands are in that map to the right of Lajos Kossuth. And I've done it in a way that it's delimited by ethnicity. All the green areas are areas where Hungarians form the majority. Purple areas are Romanians, red are Serbians, blue are Croatians, yellow are German speakers, and sort of that brown color are Ukrainians. And so naturally, when Lajos Kossuth brings his brigade of hussar cavalry and proclaims we are all Hungarians, the natural response of all these other people is no, we're not. And so you have a number of different peoples from the territory that would become the Hungarian Empire revolting and supporting the Austrian government in repressing the Hungarian revolution. And the two of these that are the most important to us are the Croats under Ban Josip Jelačić and the Serbians who declare their state of Vojvodina. Right? This is the first time that the Serbians actually declare an independent state north of the Danube River. And while the state of Serbian Vojvodina is disbanded in 1849 by the Austrian government to create the Banat, Temeshvar, and Vojvodina, the Serbians have an outsized authority in that territory under Austrian control after the 1848 revolutions. On the right-hand side, we have the Wallachian Revolution of 1848. Now, remember, Wallachia was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, but was still nominally independent, and there was a revolution there to implement democracy and liberalism within Wallachia. The Russians and Ottomans both worked together to put it down, the one time that the two of them could agree on anything. And so you had large-scale Russian and Ottoman occupation of Wallachia following the revolution. I have a question of whether or not the United States was developing influence in creating these liberal and conservative revolutions. And I have to say, not really. The United States, its ideas of liberal democracy were important, certainly, in fomenting the French Revolution, but a lot of the leaders of these rebellions were remarking on the French ideals more so than the American ideals. For example, they talked about the rights of man and citizen. They talked about ethnic solidarity. These ideas were not issues. These issues were sort of secondary to the Americans and more principal to the French. That said, after Kossuth was defeated in 1849 and forced into exile, he moved to the United States, where he spoke English incredibly well. He was known for being an orator, and he gave speeches throughout the eastern coast of the United States, from New York down to Washington, D.C. And I believe he retired here for a while before going back to Europe. He was never able to go back to Hungary, though, even though in modern Hungary today, he's considered a national hero. So after the Wallachian Revolution was stamped out in 1848, the Romanians had to wait a while for things to change. And the first major change was after the Crimean War, the question of the future of these Danubian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia was discussed. And the treaty ending the Crimean War said that the Ottoman government would give to the people of Moldavia and Wallachia the ability to choose their own singular prince. Sorry, their own singular king, so that way that they could be governed according to their own will. Now, there was one loophole in the treaty that the Wallachians and Moldavians spotted immediately, which is that it never said that they couldn't both elect the same person. So that's exactly what they did. In 1862, they proclaimed that they would both vote for Alexandru Ioan Cuza. And so in his person, it became a personal union of Moldavia and Wallachia to create one united Romanian state. And that Romanian state would eventually employ many of the revolutionaries who had been crushed in 1848 in terms of its creation. Now, Ioan Cuza was hated by both the liberals and the conservatives because his reforms failed to improve the Romanian economy. So he was replaced in 1866 by another foreign monarch. But Romania in this period begins to consolidate and becomes a modern nation state, such that by 1877, during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, their troops, allied with the Russians, crossed the Danube into the Ottoman Empire under their own brigades, won several victories, and created for themselves a Romanian consciousness, in addition to their previous Moldavian and Wallachian culture that was now being united. We also have the development of the Bulgarian national consciousness at this point in time. Now, earlier, you have people like St. Paisius of Ilandar being one of the monasteries of Mount Athos, which is a Greek Orthodox church. St. Paisius writes his treatise Historia Slaviano-Bulgarskaya, or the Slavo-Bulgarian history. And in this history, he codified the creation of the Bulgarian people and their trajectory through reality, and hoping that that reality would come back again. And the person who really becomes the engine of that is Vasilevsky. There are a number of other people as well. He goes into Wallachia during this sort of inter period and forms a number of organizations dedicated to promoting the Bulgarian cause. He becomes a member of Filikieteria, and he begins to promote rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. One time when he was in the empire, he was caught and hanged, which is why he dies in 1873. But because of him, we have an increasing push for the Bulgarians to separate from the Greek Orthodox Church. And so you have the splitting of the church in what is called the Bulgarian Exarchate. An exarchate is an autocephalous church that is not recognized by the dominant church, right? We talked about how the Serbian Orthodox Church is recognized by the Greek Orthodox Church. The Bulgarian Church is not. But the Ottomans see that the Bulgarians are protesting in the 1850s and want their own church. And so he approves of this, which results in the creation of St. Stephen's Church in Balat in Constantinople, which becomes the head of that millet, the Bulgarian millet. And there is a vote among all of the Orthodox congregations of the Balkans whether they want to be part of the millet of Rome, or they want to be part of the Bulgarian millet. And you can see by the map on the lower right-hand side, most of the territories that form what is today Bulgaria, parts of Romania, parts of southern Serbia, North Macedonia, and southern Macedonia and Thrace. These areas vote to become part of the Bulgarian Exarchate. Bulgarians today use this as an argument that there's no distinction between themselves and North Macedonians because of this unity. So we start developing in 1876 a number of separate revolts by the different Balkan peoples to promote their independence once again. These rebellions begin to catch the attention of Europeans once more. In particular, you have the Batak massacre. So the story behind this was that in 1876, inspired by Vasilevsky, although he was dead by this point, but inspired by his memory and the organizations he founded, the Bulgarian people revolted. And the revolt was put down relatively quickly. It took about 5 weeks for the Ottomans to put it down. But the Ottomans, after putting down that revolt, were incredibly ruthless. And so you had massacres like the one at Batak, where tens of thousands of people were killed, lots of territory was burned, and the atrocities made their way to Europe, where the people became increasingly angry about the situation. You also had the Serbs revolting in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen before that we had Bosniaks, right, the Muslims of Bosnia revolting in 1831 to try and create a more conservative system. In this case, the Serbs of Bosnia and Herzegovina are revolting against the high level of taxes that they've been forced to pay, and they wish to achieve independence. And we also have at this same time numerous revolts throughout the Greek territories that haven't yet become part of the independent kingdom of Greece. The first ones to revolt are Crete, and while we didn't talk about it during the 1820 revolution, they did revolt in 1820. Sorry, in 1821, and their revolt was put down quite substantially by the Egyptians. This revolt resulted in another revolt from them again, which was similarly put down. Conversely, the revolts in Thessaly and Epirus and on the Greek mainland, those two revolts were able to be joined by the independent Hellenic kingdom, and accordingly, they were able to achieve a degree of independence under the Greek state. Macedonia, however, would remain under Ottoman control for the foreseeable future. We also have Prince Nicolae I Petrovich Njegoš, who becomes the first ruler of an independent Montenegro. Montenegro launches a successful revolution also in 1876. Sorry, in 1860, and starts fighting for more land than just the coastal cities that it controlled. So if you can think of it today, Montenegro was sort of a square, and the part that it controlled was the part by the seaside. It begins to expand from its capital in Cetinje towards the modern city of Podgorica, which is its current capital, and further eastward during this time period in 1876. Now, this Great Eastern Crisis results in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, as the Russians feel compelled to defend all of these beleaguered peoples who are now suffering under Turkish oppression and massacres in response to their fights for liberation. The result of that war eventually is the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which creates new borders for all of the various states in the region. Serbia becomes larger, extending further southward. Bulgaria is given independence. Romania is recognized as a unified state, because even though it had been independent and had not been yet recognized by the major powers, it now was. And Montenegro expanded to its current shape. Serbia acquired that extra land. Bulgaria becomes independent, but the southernmost area of Bulgaria is considered Romania, and while it is technically Bulgarian, it is still under Ottoman sovereignty, whereas the rest of Bulgaria is actually independent. And it was unclear what would happen to this border territory between Bulgaria and Romania, but this area called Northern Dobruja was given to Romania so that the Russians could take this area with the fortresses of Ismail and Karel, which they wanted. This area, of course, that was part of the Russian Empire then, is part of Ukraine now. The one group that we haven't talked about, right, are the Armenians. And while there are Armenians in Constantinople, the majority of Armenians live much further east in the empire. They live closer to Lake Von. And you can see these Armenian majority regions here alongside the lake. The darker the blue, the higher the percentage of Armenians. Regions that are like this color are around 20%. Regions like this are closer to 50%, and regions like this are over 50%. And as a result of the war of 1877 to 1878, some of the easternmost parts of Anatolia came under Russian control. You can see, of course, here this is what is now modern Armenia, which is why it has an Armenian majority, all that repatriation during the 19th century. But within the Ottoman Empire, throughout this period, all the way till 1878, the Armenians are not agitating for anything close to independence. There are no revolutionary or reactionary organizations in Armenia at this point. We will see some in the future, and we'll definitely cover that as we get closer to that time period. And they petitioned the Sublime Porte, they petitioned the Ottoman Sultan for increased rights. And you can see an Armenian protest from the 1860s in the upper right-hand side. The Armenians were coming under attack from the Kurdish Agha, or nobility, and the Kurdish Agha were fighting because similarly to Hussein Karadzic in Bosnia, these were ions who were losing their authority to more centralized state structures, and so they were taking out, they were fighting back, and the way that they decided to fight back was by massacring the Armenian population that they knew was important to the Sultan. And so these Armenians were petitioning for the right of self-defense, which they never got. The Armenians also petitioned for a number of legal changes that would make them the full equals of Ottoman citizens, Ottoman Muslim citizens. They got some in part, but not a significant amount. And the majority of Armenians, especially the Amira class Armenians in Istanbul, were relatively acquiescent towards the Ottoman government, and willing to go along with it, not to associate with the Filikieteria, not to connect with these Balkan revolutions. They saw themselves as something quite apart. And to the extent that they had relations with Russia, very favorable relations with Russia, they saw that as purely diplomatic at this point. For this, they were called the Millet-i Sadıka, or the faithful millet, the loyal millet, because they were the only millet that had not at any point erupted in violence from among the Christians, right? Among the Jews, of course, there were no rebellions, but that was sort of expected because the Jews were a very small population. The Armenians, being significantly larger and more concentrated, were their loyalty was much more noted. So, any questions, comments, concerns?
So Richard, hi, how are you? From last presentation, you were saying that Armenians were resettled, or in the presentation of the Crusades. I'm confusing the two. You're saying
no. It was the okay. Well, it depends where they were resettled to.
Yeah. So talking about the kingdom of Trapezoid and all other areas that were not inherently Armenian. So in the Lake Van, was it their inherent area where they lived?
Yes. If we're talking about historic Armenia is this, roughly speaking. This is not going to be exact because, so that's historic Armenia. And you can see that there is a large Armenian population there. But the reason that the Armenian population is here in Yerevan, to the extent that it is because of the Russian repatriation in the 19th century. Starting in 1826 with the Treaty of Turkmenchai, the Russians controlled that territory, and they began to promote Armenian migration, both from the Ottoman Empire and the Persian empires. It was the Qajar Persian Empire, to that area, and that migration was sufficient enough to make them the majority there. Now, if you look here very close to the Mediterranean, you also see that there's a large Armenian population there, and that is the remnant of Armenian Cilicia, which we were covering during the Crusades presentation, right? Now, there aren't that many Armenians there today, and that's because of a certain set of events that happened from 1915 to 1919, which we're definitely going to cover in one of these stories. But that's the reason why there are very few Armenians in any of these provinces today. The genocide, to the extent that it was effective primarily in these majority Armenian regions.
Now, a lot of this Slavic countries, as you have mentioned, Bosnia, Serbia, declared an independence. Was it primarily religious lineage, or this was just still looking for independence and there was really no association of Orthodoxy or Catholicism? And I don't know where Croatia was at the point.
Well, Croatia was Catholic. All these other states, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, these were all Orthodox states. To the extent that the church was involved, and they were heavily involved in the Greek and Bulgarian revolutions especially, they were involved from a justification and legitimation perspective. In the case of the Greek revolt, we actually have cases of Greek bishops leading soldiers into battle, but generally speaking, the people who were responsible for commanding were lay people. And And so the war was actually waged by lay people. The governmental organizations were actually put together by lay people. But that said, we have very holy war type language, especially coming out of the Greek revolt, and to a lesser extent coming out of the Bulgarian revolt. Remember also that the creation of the Bulgarian Exarchate was the chief marker of Bulgarian national identity, was membership in the Bulgarian Exarchate. And so in many ways, the church defined who would be part of this nationalistic movement, because the Slavic languages that were spoken throughout the Balkans, if you go sort of in a crescent shape from Slovenia all the way to Bulgaria, are related languages. In the same way that, for example, if you started in Barcelona and went all the way to Lisbon, you'd hit a bunch of related languages that slowly passed from Catalan to Aragonese to Castilian to Asturian to Galician to Portuguese, and none of these is terribly independent than the one next to it, but people have to make a division, and so these divisions tend to come along with the rifts in the churches. And in fact, when it comes to the delineation between the Croats, the Bosniaks, and the Serbs, the delineation is quite clearly religious, right? Croats is a Catholic, Bosniak is a Sunni Muslim, and Serb is Orthodox Christian. And they do end up speaking different languages slightly. They have different words and vocabulary because of the self-isolation.
The thing I'm very, I'm sorry, clogging the question. The thing I was very interested in, and maybe you can comment on that. You know how Bulgaria was, we know about Great Bulgaria after the Bulgar from the Volga had dissipated an Asparuh. And then you had a Bulgaria boy who was the, Basil, who destroyed a lot of the Bulgaria back in 900 AD. And then all of a sudden we have almost for 1,000 years, no Bulgaria. But how did the ethnos was able to, kind of like came back to its own after almost 1,000 years of being non-independent, through, Byzantium and, the Ottoman, sorry.
Well, no, this is what Saint Paisius of Hilandar was doing with his Slavo-Bulgarian history, right? The Bulgars that you're talking about are Turkic people who moved into this territory, right? And then later organized the Slavs who lived there into their own governments. And those governments eventually fell to both the Ottomans and the Byzantines. But by creating this Slavo-Bulgarian history, Paisius of Hilandar continued the story of the Bulgarians through these empires and noted them as a Slavic-speaking people under these various different occupations, and tried to create a national consciousness and identity for these Slavic Bulgarians, not just resigning the Bulgarians to the past. It's similarly to the creation of the Serb national identity, the creation of the Greek national identity. This was the creation of the Bulgarian national identity. And a lot of people sort of think that if it's intentionally written that somehow it's false or that it's not meaningful. All identities are in the that are pertaining to countries or history or culture are created. They're created by people believing in those unifying principles and those stories of nationhood. Right, the American noble myth of the Constitutional Convention and the Bill of Rights and the creation of and the admittance of the states and the exploration of the West and all these kinds of things, that national mythos is what binds Americans together. And it doesn't mean that these things didn't happen. And they did indeed happen. And it's not the case that what Paisius of Hilandar is writing about in terms of the Slavic history of Bulgaria didn't happen. It absolutely happened. But to create that story that weaves those events together to create meaning that people can extract from it, and that meaning codified in the sense of a cultural or national identity, that's the work that these intellectuals are doing. And it's incredibly grueling work in terms of the storytelling mechanics of it, and to make it gripping in a way that people want to actually listen and take it on board.
I wonder how Bulgarians and Serbians separated. They are both Slavic, both Orthodox. I mean, it's
Well,
The-
the two of them were split pretty early on because the Serbians were part of the Serbian Orthodox Church, even before the Battle of Kosovo, in the 1300s. Sorry, in 1289. And the Bulgarians were part of the Greek Orthodox Church with their own unique Slavic liturgy, but they were part of the Greek Orthodox Church until the separation of the Exarchate in the 1850s. So there was,
But they were very close. They both are Orthodox, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
it's-
no, they're absolutely close. But in terms of delineating who was a Serb and who was a Bulgarian, that delineation you could find pretty easily. Yeah, that delineation you could find pretty easily in the church membership. Now, the question, of course, and this was something that we covered Aaron and I covered in our Macedonian identity lecture, which is, of course, available like all these other lectures on Zach's YouTube page, Omnicorda. Well, Zach's YouTube page or Omnicorda, and it's the struggle for the Macedonian identity, where the Bulgarians appropriated the Macedonian identity because they said these people are part of the Bulgarian Exarchate, they must be Bulgarian. And the Serbs said no, they're part of the Serbian state because Serbia expanded southwards in the Balkan Wars, and so the area of North Macedonia came under their control. And so they said, no, they're part of the Serbian world. They must be something distinct. They must be a Macedonian ethnicity. And so Macedonians today have this ethnicity, but the delineation between what is Macedonian and what is Bulgarian is still something that is a conjecture and a question of nationalism forming in the moment.
and they also Macedonians being contested with Greeks, right?
Right. No, the Macedonians and Greeks don't disagree about that Macedonians are Slavs and therefore Greek
Right.
Macedonians, like Slavic Macedonians don't consider Greek Macedonians to be Slavic Macedonians. And conversely, Greek Macedonians don't consider Slavic Macedonians to be Greek Macedonians. The two of them see each other as different. They're contesting the name of the territory and the legitimacy of succeeding the historic Macedonian states. But with Bulgaria and Macedonia, the Bulgarians literally argue there is no such thing as a Macedonian. All Slavic Macedonians are in truth Bulgarians. And Macedonians disagree.
And Romanians, I don't think they identify themselves as Slavs. They may be Slavs in big portion of it, but they don't think of themselves as Slavs, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder why, because they still DNA wise they're more Slavs, right? But maybe because of the language.
I mean, the thing is that ethnicity is very non-DNA dependent. Now, DNA
Right,
can definitely help you if you have an endogamous group, right? A group that marries itself. Like, for example, the Druze of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. The Druze only marry other Druze, and so if you test somebody genetically, you can pretty easily tell whether or not they're Druze. But in most cases, ethnicities are not that way. Most ethnicities are based on the common cultural heritage because people move between borders all the time, and they just assimilate. The question is whether is the speed of that movement and the political circumstances of that movement, right? So if that movement is because of a war and so you have a large settlement of new people, well, okay, they're not going to assimilate. But if you have a situation like, for example, in the United States, there's about 3 million people who immigrate to the United States in any given year and 3 million people who leave the United States in any given year. And that's just natural ebb and flow of business people. Now, on top of that, you have actual immigration, right? But there's that 3 million in and out who are coming, and that's just going to become a natural part of the country. That's an expectation that 1% of your population is, or 0.5% of your population is just going to be in and out. Outside of immigration, and they will absorb a certain degree of the national characteristics because of their time there. Now, I have a question about the link to the map in Cyrillic. I don't know how to send a link while I'm in the presentation, so I can't do that, but I will put a link to it in the comments. I believe it's from Wikipedia, actually, to be honest. So if you go to the Congress of Berlin in 1878, and you go to the Russian page, it should be there. It should be there.
But it's not Russian. It's Slavic language, but it's not Russian.
Yes, no, I'm saying I got it from the Russian page. I think the
Okay.
actual map is in Bulgarian.
Oh, it's Bulgarian. Yeah, that's right. So it's Istochna would be eastern.
Yeah, right. Eastern
Romania.
Not to be-
What
I
is
think they blocked
Romania?
Wikipedia and
So I put a paper in there just a couple minutes ago, and it's a really good paper on the development of Bulgarian nationalism for any of you that want to go down that hole. It's pretty interesting
exactly.
actually, because it illuminates the Russian influence and the development of identity through not just language, which I think tend to think about it, but through sort of material development. So like books, like the first books that were written in Bulgarian, actually a famous, relatively speaking, within that world, Ukrainian Slav, Yuri Ventilin, I think that's probably pretty close. And he wrote what's considered to be the first sort of Bulgarian book, which then obviously everybody gobbled up, and and away we went. And then obviously dozens of other books were written. This was in the 1830s and 40s, basically. So if you're interested, that's it's pretty cool.
So Richard, some weeks back, I asked you about like so much of the early parts of these histories struck me as just being extremely tribal and borders moving around all the time. And then in the course of this, we've talked about the various Christian and Islam, Jewish, Christian, and Islam sects. And I think it's occurring to me that the part of the reason it seems squishy is because all of those things are interacting in different proportions throughout this history. And just obviously not coincidental because of what's going on, but today I happen to be reading what I was reading about the development of collective Ukrainian memory. So distinguishing between an ethnicity versus an identity, literally identity. And it very much resembled what you were talking about here tonight. And at the same time, or a little earlier or later, I can't remember which, but I was reading about, it was an article about why Pope Francis spoke about what's going on Sunday, but did not directly name the Russians, but then the Vatican Secretary of State very much did. And this brought in this whole conflict among the Orthodox Church that was created by recognizing the Ukrainian Church as separate from the Russian Orthodox. And if you can go further into that, and apparently this is part of what motivates Putin as well. The Saint Vladimir, I don't know if you've heard of him, but I guess what I'm getting at is it sort of is not all cut and dried. I mean, my sense that this is very squishy, and I mean squishy in the sense, not that these details aren't known, but that's why it's constant. There's this constant flux, is that so much of it is a kind of, it's retrofitting through history, through language, through area, through tribe, and through religion. So yes, it is infinitely fungible, right?
The thing is that when you look at people have this idea that the identities and nationalities and religions that they observe are the same from the moment of their creation to the moment of the present, and that's just not the case. Judaism as it existed in different centuries is not the same as Judaism is now. Like there's a reason why Shabbatai Tzvi, for example, was able to galvanized people in the 17th century, where I don't think that a similar messianic candidate could do those kinds of things today. I just don't. I think that Judaism has moved in different ways since then, especially with regards to the creation of, liberal Judaism and so on. Within Orthodox Christianity, there's another key piece that's worth considering, and it's not just that religion changes over time, but that Orthodox Christianity is based on a system of patriarchs, and those patriarchs have no superior. So each patriarch represents an area, a territorial area, and the congregants of that area. And primus inter pares, the first among equals, is the Patriarch of Constantinople. The other four patriarchs would have been the Patriarch of Rome, which is the Pope and is now outside of the Orthodox Church, and the patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, which, because of Islamic control for long periods of time, those patriarchies don't really have much power. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is this primus inter pares, and it decides what these other patriarchs are, and to the extent that they exist and have power. And the situation that developed with the Bulgarians is that the Bulgarians were Greek Orthodox. They were under his direct rule as the Patriarch of Constantinople, but their service and liturgy was in Slavonic, which is the old Slavic language. You can think of it sort of like Shakespearean English in the Slavic world, right? And it was done that way because they didn't speak Greek, which is fine, right? But they were just part of his Greek Orthodox world. And they wanted, because they were feeling more and more as Bulgarians, they wanted a church that reflected that, because the other patriarchs are delimited by the regional affiliation. The Serbian Orthodox Church, the Georgian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. All of these groups are organized by their region and national identity that corresponds to that in this more romantic, enlightened period of the 19th century.
So that exacerbates the pre-existing sort of tensions that have gone on for centuries.
Yeah, if it does, if the argument is that we shouldn't recognize difference, right? This is sort of.
No, I'm not trying to make a case for anything. Again, it's more that the sense of, and it makes sense in a way of what's going on now in the world. I mean,
the point that I'm making is that your assertion is that by recognizing these differences with the creation of an ossified form that will define them, that you're going to exacerbate tensions. And I agree that does exacerbate tensions, but also not creating that ossified form as an intentional decision, right? When people are petitioning for it, also exacerbates tensions, just in the other direction. Right.
I'm not trying to make a finite case. I guess what I'm saying is that these areas are inherently fungible if you get the right charismatic or the right megalomaniac or the right combination of events. You're always going to be able to create a legitimate story, also illegitimate ones, but a legitimate story that creates identity. Is that not correct?
But that's not unique to this region. That's
I'm not saying it is, but I don't understand this region as well as I do like the United States, right? So
sure, but let's take this to the United States, right? Because then we're an even playing field. The entire mythology, and I use mythology in a non-judgmental way.
No, I understand that entirely.
The entire mythology of the progressive movement, right, comes out of the declarations of Teddy Roosevelt and a number of other individuals who existed alongside of him, who basically said that the government understands to a far greater degree than any individual could what is in the best interest of the individual. And therefore, we should empower the government through the creation of numerous executive agencies to administer the lives of individuals to an extent that they cannot administer themselves.
Right, but that grew directly out of the Gilded Age.
Right. So no. I'm not saying that the mythology was illegitimate.
Right.
What I'm saying is that created something around which people have rallied, and that has become a political identity in the United States.
Exactly.
So-
And most people don't trace it back. And then they never
That
trace
way.
it even before that into the utilitarians and into basically, Germanic Protestants and Dutch. And I mean, just you can really stretch it back. And I mean, you have to get into the weeds, but this idea of having a strong, proactive, sort of a utilitarian, administrative, state, and with the best interest of its people in the most democratic definition of that, like in the purest form of democracy, almost a referenda, but in the public will. And that goes back to these revolutions that we were just talking about in the 1830s.
Right. I'm not
20s.
trying to get
Yeah.
anything that static or granular. I think I'm getting at what you're all getting at, but I'm thinking of it in a different way. Like I said, this fungibility, I think it's human nature. And I don't think we do a very good job trying to dissuade people from it, to fall into this concept that what I see around me now is what always has been, and my grandfather said, and my great-grandfather said.
Well,
So it tends to get very, people have this mythology that things don't change, that it is
Right.
now what it always
sure.
was. I think.
but I
that-
mean, if you live in the Upper East Side or whatever, Soho or in Cobble Hill, there becomes over time, if you stay there long enough, right? If you're just there in your 20s and you kind of
You never
bounce
leave.
around and do that thing, but if you really anchor yourself to a place, or if you grew up in a place in New York or any place, but I think New York's in a weird
New York
way
moves
a
pretty
good
quickly, that's
analogy.
why.
Yeah. And people create the mythologies of these places. I mean, it might not have the same, let's say, intensity that we associate with outside heavier identities in the world, but it is an identity. I mean, there's no way to say
Right, but
it's
it's.
not.
No, and I actually agree with you that we do a very poor job of teaching people the non-staticity of reality, right?
Yes.
But how would you
perfect,
do
thank
that?
you.
I
Richard?
completely agree with you. The first time that I actually encountered this was Moby Dick. There's a famous line in the book, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't remember it off the top of my head. But Ishmael is asking Ahab why it is that he's spent his entire life chasing this whale, and Ahab says, because when I finally take it, I will peel back the curtain of reality and understand what is happening.
Yeah,
That the rest of the book I couldn't care less about because it's about
right.
harpooning
No,
and
but that's, yeah, exactly.
but
That's about a lot of other stuff, but that's
Yeah,
another story. I'm a huge, massive Moby Dick guy. So
okay,
that's
so
another story.
we'll draw swords later. But
Yes, exactly.
but that moment where I just sat there and I was like, why does he think that destroying a whale is going to explain the nature of reality to him? And I
Because he's
started beginning to
obsessive, that's why.
but the thing is that
He's become
the thing is he's created this mythology of
Right,
what the whale is, and that whale is the determiner of his existence.
exactly.
And so that's that kind of identity creation, right?
Yeah,
So I mean, I think I agree with you. I think we should teach people very clearly that reality isn't static, and the touch points that you become familiar with, you've become familiar with due to specific experiences, but those weren't the consistent touch points through history, and those aren't the way that other people see those touch points, specifically because their historical experiences are different than yours. And that's why I have this series of 28 episodes to get to this point, because then you understand all of the animus that's been getting us here of okay, you had an Ottoman government. This Ottoman government generally treated the Orthodox relatively well, especially if you compare it to the way they were treated by Catholics in Europe. So why is there all of this antagonism and groaning? And it's because the Ottoman Empire was so resistant to the implementation of the national desires of these people. And those national desires were moving at a pace, culturally speaking, technologically speaking, ideologically speaking, that was 5 or 6 times where the Ottoman Empire was going. And we're going to see more of that in 2 weeks, how the Ottoman Empire is trying to take on these developments, and they don't know how to do it. And to the extent that they have opposition in their government, that opposition is pretty strong and pretty well solidified.
My
Um,
goodness, what you just described could be the United States at this time. Because nobody wants to admit that anything is changing and, or that anything has to change. I know people are leaving, so, but how did you say it? The non-statisticity, how did, say that phrase again,
the
of
non
reality?
the non-staticity of reality. Yeah.
Get that, okay, staticity, okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say, but I was trying to take too many words. But yeah, I think I keep looking for, because I'm less familiar with this area, I keep thinking, okay, all I have to do is get this, this, and this, and I'll understand it. And the more I stick with it, the more it's going, wait, this is exactly what's going
Right.
on here.
No, my advice to you would not to be to look for what anything is, but look at what it is becoming. So the
Yeah,
key
that's
thing,
exactly where I just got
key
to.
thing- no, but the key thing is that the processes are relatively like there are changes in the processes, right? Do you know physics well enough?
Very remotely, but
Okay, so if you have velocity, right, the derivative
Yeah.
of velocity, the rate of change of velocity is acceleration. The rate
Yeah.
of change of acceleration is jerk, right? So that's so if we're I would say the jerk is relatively constant throughout history, but the acceleration, that rate of change just keeps growing faster, and the change itself is moving faster. And so the distance you're covering as more and more time goes is increasingly huge.
And so that it's always overwhelming to mere human beings.
Right.
Well, yeah, because you have an information asymmetry mixed
Yeah.
with a human need to be more atomic.
Exactly.
Right. So we all have some need to be, not everybody, but the key is there's always a committed subpopulation that has a need to be, West Chelsean, not just Chelsea, but I'm making this up, but you know what I mean, like to be a sub of a thing, because that's either a driver of identity or there's an event, right? There's an externalized event. There's, maybe not Gregory V level, but your own version of it, right? The city approved the XYZ and they put the stop sign in the wrong place and we fought for 5 years. Well, screw that. Now we're the West Chelseas, and it's and away you go, and that's those subpopulations often drive that longer term development of identity, not in a deterministic way either. I think that people over determinize.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah.
But if we take Aaron's
that's why I'm
example,
always careful when people say we don't change fast enough. I think we change.
right. No, I was going to say, if we take Aaron's example and we sort of plug it into what I'm talking about, it's very difficult to predict that seminal event that will create the West Chelsean, right? Because that's on the distance rung of what's going on. But if you can follow the velocity area, right? Like what is the change that's going on? Oh, West Chelseans tend to be moving closer to the beach, and East Chelseans, tend to be going further inland. There's going to probably be some kind of event that divides them long term, right? And then you go to the acceleration level. What is driving people to come to Chelsea in the first place? What kind of attributes are separating West Chelsea?
What's the magnet? What's the attractor?
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
and on top of that, human limitations are always trying to plan and reason and manage according to what already happened, instead of what is happening and about to happen, which is the acceleration factor, right?
Yeah,
right. But it's one of the reasons I always like to drive a relativism with something to compare, because it's easy to say that, quote unquote, we don't change fast enough, but it's hard to find a place on Earth that's got 1/3 of a billion human beings that changes, that has this many hundreds of thousands of active changes going on.
No, I'm not trying to make a case for that. What I'm saying is the thing that we keep losing track of is the need for humility. And humility is like the bottom line here. As long as you think that you can have a beat on exactly what's going on and what's going to happen, you already screwed it up, because you can't. That's the whole
That's
point.
an evolutionary design within us.
Yeah, unfortunately, because we keep
well, it's very fortunate
washing
we
up
wouldn't
on
have
the
got
beat.
here with that, though.
What's
Without
that?
that confidence.
I think we've sort of worn this topic down.
Yes, we have.
I was going to say, is if there's not anything else, I think we can close it down.
I just
Um,
realized where everybody was going, to the State of the Union.
oh, the State of the Union is tonight.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to that. I don't ever
No,
watch
but
that
I've
when I
been
was in
noticing
charge.
people dropping off, and I was like, why is everybody leaving all of a sudden? Just realized why. No, I didn't mean to like get
No,
off
no.
the track.
No. And like I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a question that really appeals to the discussion that we're having tonight, as opposed to some of the other episodes where um this episode you really see behind the curtain of
Yeah.
how do people come to the consensus that they are X? Because it's something that we've taken inherent, like I mean, when we learn in school, right? You had the American Revolution, and then suddenly everybody was an American. Before the Revolution, they were British colonists. What
Exactly.
happened? And we never talk about that. We never talk about that moment where people actually decided or didn't decide that they were American, and what ramification did that have? And to the extent that it had a ramification, did they decide that they were American? Did they decide that they were North Carolinian? Did they decide that they were from their assorted town? And once in a while they would go vote for some random person in Washington, D.C. Like, the degrees of identity are really complicated, even in a country like the United States, where we seem to have a more static, at least at present, understanding of national identity. One of the key things that people forget is that prior to the Civil War, the United States was a plural. The United States
Yes. Yes,
and
exactly.
after the Civil War, we were singular. Then the United States is. And the
Is.
reason for that was the increasing federalization of the country, and the idea that we were no longer a union of states, but a federation that was composed of different sub-entities.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the way I have always understood the way human beings identify and split and move, and it has been through linguistics and cultural identities, that sort of thing. So it completely made sense to me when I started reading about creating, I think it was about creating the Ukrainian memory, and it's a fascinating topic, but it's the way I think. So I understood that exactly, and I've been trying to find something more concrete in what you've been saying, and feeling kind of inadequate but you're saying exactly what I kind of already
No,
understood, right?
on the Ukraine piece, what basically happened is that it was the reverse of the Bulgarian situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the Russians believe that that Ukraine is part of the Patriarchate of Moscow of Russia, and several different groups declared autocephaly, meaning that they were self-governing.
Yes.
And the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2018, 2019 recognized a single Ukrainian patriarchate, which would be a union of those two splinter groups.
Yes.
And so the Russian Orthodox Church rejects this.
Yes.
There's a question of how do you we access the next part of the program. The next part of the program is already on Meetup. It's the meeting on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. I don't remember the exact title off the top of my head, but it should be something like Napoleon and Muhammad Ali Pasha.
That's what it is, exactly. Yes, thank you.
So yeah, so sign up for that if you like the sound of my grating voice. And yeah, so that's and all of the subsequent meetings will be on Thursdays.
Yeah. No, I wasn't looking for a specific answer on any of these specific topics. I was looking for what I guess I was looking for is just that there is no concrete answers to any of this stuff. It is as fungible as it's always seemed to me.
Yes, but
over the course of time.
It's not perfectly fungible.
No, but it is possible.
It's open to interpretation. But
Yes.
you can say that about any.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Anything. Yeah.
No. Well, I mean, there are scientific things, right?
But no. I mean, but any culture and country and that sort of thing. The identities, you can do that with, yeah.
So. No, but
I guess I keep looking for something that's a little more concrete than the way I feel, and concrete is the wrong direction.
No, but people tend to think of identities as being concrete because they see some sort of ancestral line or genetics or specific events, and those things are all concrete. What they don't realize is that what matters about the genetics is actually nothing. Genetics doesn't tell us anything about ethnicity. It tells us who your parents are, but think about all the people who've discovered that their fathers aren't their true fathers because 23andMe revealed that their mother had an affair.
Exactly, yes. But
Like,
here's another thing that was going on while you were going through tonight's presentation. You're talking about Karageorge, however you pronounce it in that his language, and I'm thinking of the people I know who have some form of the name Karageorge as a surname in the United States, an Americanized version of that particular. So whoever that is, their ancestors immigrated from that region. And then you're talking about Mavro, this and that. I know people who, that's the first 5 letters of their Greek
Mavro
name.
is the Greek word for black.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, but you went on. But I know a number of Greek people that have Mavro as the first letters of their Greek name, Mavrophridis, for example.
Yeah.
So that's I guess what I'm saying is that's the way I tend to think of things in terms of linguistics and language and cultural development. So those things pop out at me as you're going through this. And now as we get closer to the current era, I'm going to find more things that I can tie into directly, right?
Right. And the thing is, like, for example, when it comes to the Greek language, right, you have the whole Katharavousa movement and the Demotiki movement, right? The Demotiki movement was to try and write the Greek that people actually speak on a day-to-day basis. And it was a very liberal movement. Today, Demotiki is the only Greek language that's written. Katharavousa exists, but it's very formal. Like you'll see it, like if a diplomat is greeting another diplomat, they might speak Katharavousa. But people write in Demotiki now, people speak in Demotiki. That's the language of Greece. But at that time, that was just too liberal. Like the established Greek leadership couldn't accept something that was so guttural. It would be like trying to
Populism, yeah.
No, it would be like trying to convince somebody to speak in African American vernacular English and give a lecture in it.
Yeah.
It would seem gross to people.
And wasn't there
it's not to say there's anything gross about speaking African American vernacular English, but it's about our prejudices towards the way that languages change and dialect.
And also the relative ability to accept other in speaking, right?
There's a very important Eubonics was.
Let me finish this. There's a very important component with identity, which is when others have sort of earned the right to share that identity, and that rarely happens instantaneously, right? That happens over time and generations. And so a subgroup will develop an identity and really protect it, and then it sort of amplifies, and then it gets reprotected. So there's a conservatism even within identity that occurs. And so this process is this sort of developmental process, almost biological, really, at a certain point. And
you can have the tension between separatism and integration. I mean, remember the argument about Eubonics, about a couple of decades ago, which was very heated, extremely heated.
Well, I mean, and to just, not only make this an American thing because it's sort of irrelevant, but I mean, you have a similar dynamic in other places. You go to Mexico and
yes, I understand that. I'm just relating it to the U.S. because I understand it better.
Yeah, but my point is that you have the same dynamic, literally. In
I understand that. Yes. Yeah. And it's human, therefore it is spread throughout the world. I don't know particularly about I think maybe the only real difference might be the Extreme Orient. I think there may be more, but I don't know enough about it to say.
Wait, there might be more what?
More, what am I trying to say?
Acceptance of linguistic
like homogeneous populations?
No, because that's why I didn't say homogeneity, because what I know about it, it's not homogeneous.
Well, Japan is. I mean,
acceptance of mystery, maybe. Acceptance of the idea that it is not all knowable, therefore, and that is an element of humility that I think is oftentimes missing in Western cultures.
I would say that it depends if we're talking about Easterns who are religious and Easterns who are not religious.
Exactly.
Yeah, correct.
And I would also say that the idea of unknowability is also very common in Islam. We addressed that actually in the first lecture, is that most Muslim groups that survive today, which are called Ashari, both in the Sunni and Shiite camp, believe that God is unknowable and that reality is unknowable, even if the Sharia and its implementation for humans is knowable. So it creates that sort of functional
Well,
dichotomy.
Catholicism is
But-
like that, but
No,
it's
because, no,
it
because no,
says
Catholicism,
that.
Catholicism talks about a personal and important relationship with God who sacrificed himself for you upon the cross.
Right, but God himself or herself is unknowable, but in everyday usage, that is completely forgotten, and everybody thinks they're walking around knowing God's mind.
Right. Now,
That's what
now,
I'm
now,
saying. That's
now,
the
now, now, I
content
agree
there.
with you that a number of Buddhist sects, especially Pure Land, that tend to teach sublimation of the self, are ones that don't try to impose a rigid nature of organization on the universe. But that's one way of being religious in the East. There are other ways of being religious in the East that are very state-centric, like Shinto shamanism tends to be very state-centric and
Mhm.
very regimented in its understanding of reality. You
Some
have,
parts of Hinduism and Sikhism is that way
Yeah.
also.
yeah. I was also going to say that in a lot of parts of East Asia, statism and materialism have replaced, to a large degree, any sort of religious
Yeah.
self-identity.
Yeah.
And I mean, materialism in a large part has replaced the religiosity of Europe as well.
I think it to an even greater degree, but I think, yeah, I agree. Yeah, well, it just fascinates me. I mean, it's like, it's, even if I can't have a knowledge, a final knowing, it's like the quest for understanding is what seems to fascinate me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad everybody who stays is staying. If you want to go, I mean, you always are free to go. That's the 2-hour promise. But no, I think at a fundamental level, this history, it can shine a light on your own history and your own self-understanding, even though I'm not talking about that, because people tend to see things far away with a much more scientific lens than they're able to apply to their own reality. I mean, that's why, for example, you have Arthur Miller's The Crucible, right? He writes about Puritan Massachusetts when he's actually trying to comment on the current anti-communist witch hunts during his own life.
Yes.
So you have these kinds of relationships as well. And so
Yeah, fascinating though, Richard. I really enjoy but my biggest frustration is really looking at the various names that you have on the screen and trying to connect them with the pronunciation. That's the hardest thing for me, is remembering those names because they don't look like the way you pronounce them. And that again, that makes me even more aware of that whole language issue. But yeah, I mean, I really am fascinated by all this. I don't necessarily remember it all well, but it fascinates me.
yeah, no, I try to if something is already represented in Latin characters, I'm kind of stuck using the spelling that already exists. If something is from Arabic or from Persian or something where there's no standardized Latin spelling, I try to spell them the same way, using the same kinds of letters, like the S with the mark is sh, the C
Yeah.
with the mark is ch. I try to do that. Doesn't always work out well, but
No, I'm not criticizing. I grow more familiar just with the practice. What I'm saying is, at my age, it's harder to like look at something and hear and connect what I'm hearing with what I'm looking at. I'm not criticizing you at all. It's fascinating.
no.
It gives me an opportunity to stretch, which
No, but like-
at my age you need to do.
No, but like this is a perfect example of how confusing and difficult this is. So this is the letter J in Serbian.
Yes.
This is the letter J in Bosnian, which is the same language, by the way. So like there are some dialectic differences, but they're the same language. So Kara George, right, is
Was
this,
with the D with the cross, yeah.
but Haji is like this.
With a Z, yeah, okay. That's what I mean. And that, again, if I had not, I actually studied Russian in school. So a lot of my understanding of the geopolitical stuff comes from that, but also the familiarity with some of the Cyrillic alphabet and some of the pronunciation. It's been many years since I've tried to do that. And as you just pointed out, the various areas and nationalities you're talking about do have different representations of the same sounds.
And then the other issue that I have when it comes to Arabic names is we have a lot of sounds in Arabic that don't have a clear rendering in Latin characters. Like, for example, we were talking about Oman the other day, and the government that ruled them was Ya'rubid. How do you do that? Like, how do you write that? Ya'rubid. Like,
Yeah.
like we don't have this letter. And so you have to sort of go for the lowest common denominator of just like putting that apostrophe.
Right. Which again, though, it at the same time you're trying to create understanding, you are also discreating understanding, because you have to do that. You have to go for the lowest common, and least common denominators oftentimes are major disruptions among human beings.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, look, if I could do half the presentation in Arabic and half the presentation in English, I think when we get to the Arab world, it would make a lot more sense. But the thing is
Well,
that, you know, it makes a lot more sense to give the presentation in one language, and one language that everybody can understand.
just the number of different representations of Muhammad I've come across in my lifetime. I mean, it seems almost infinite, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know, maybe I'm imagining that, but is that?
No, but like the thing is also, right, for example, Mehmet, the sultans of the Ottoman
Muhammad.
Empire, Mehmet, that's Muhammad in Turkish.
Yeah, so is Ramses, son of Moses. You know, I mean, but that's what I'm saying. A lot of this stuff I understand more through linguistics than I do through history. And I'm now, as you're doing this, some of it, like, all of a sudden I go, oh, duh, you know, because something I know from linguistics, I'm hearing you say in a whole different way.
Yeah.
Which is, again, that's why it fascinates me, is that the more you look at this stuff, the more connections there are. And yet at the same time, human beings are stumbling along and bumbling along and creating all kinds of antagonisms among each other without being able to see all these commonalities.
Yeah.
All these, like, that so many things are just different aspects of the same exact thing.
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't express myself really well, I suppose, but
No,
yeah,
it makes sense.
do you understand that kind of fascination that I have? Yeah,
No, I mean,
it's
the thing is, if these specificities didn't captivate us, they wouldn't become our identities, right? So it's self-fulfilling that those things that captivate us necessarily don't captivate others, because the things that don't create strong emotions, like grass, like, people don't fight over grass.
Have you ever been to suburbia?
Okay, fair enough. When the water restrictions came on in Arizona, everybody was fighting for their grass. But like, anyway, I've got to go.
Yeah, me too. I am grateful for the chance to talk with you further, though. I really enjoy what you do, and
Thank you.
I
enjoy the engagement.
Even when I'm tired, it's like I think, oh God, it's Tuesday night, I'm too tired. And then before I even realize it, I'm like wide awake, because you're fascinating me as I'm struggling to say, do you really get what he's talking about? So it just is a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
All right, no worries. Bye,
All right.
everybody.
Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful week. See you soon. I forget how to, oh yeah, leave. All right. Thank you.